Good to go.
All righty. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here to speak today. Thank you, Neil, for initially touching base. It's been an incredible time spending yesterday and now today with you guys. My name is Andrew Iler. I'm an Ontario lawyer from Canada. I practice mainly in corporate and commercial law and administrative law, and a lot of my day job is managing large class action litigation with a team of U.S. attorneys in the United States. So while I'm not a U.S. attorney, I'm not licensed to practice in the U.S. A lot of the time, I do focus on U.S. litigations. You can go to the next slide. I am the co-author with Paul Blow, Jim D'Eugenio, Matt Crumpton, and Mark Adamczyk of the JFK assassination chokeholds. I got to congratulate Paul every time I see Paul. He and his colleague from Montreal, Marc Bernard, just finished and released the French version of chokehold. So it's a unique JFK assassination book, and that it's been done in 2 languages. Next slide. So I'm going to talk to you today about the ARRB Final Determination notifications. The general problem that I think the research community has been dealing with for years. There have been multiple investigations, the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the Church Committee, Pike Committee, the Rockefeller Commission. They all dealt with the assassination, some of them just in part, but there's been continuing secrecy over the government records that were generated from each of the investigations. There's been a refusal to release files, to allow public access to the files. And the final chapter in chokeholds deals with 62 years of suppression, obfuscation, and obstruction of justice. I think it really puts together in a unique way all the really serious problems that have happened since the assassination with the records and with the actual evidence, as we've heard and are going to hear throughout this weekend, all on different areas, whether it's the ballistics, witnesses. They really haven't allowed the public to get a full grasp of what happened during and before the assassination. As a result, there's been a massive amount of public disillusionment and mistrust. Some say November 22nd, 1963 is virtually the last day that the American public trusted their own government. Bringing it into closer perspective with regard to the records, there's been a continuing confusion. Everyone knew that the JFK Records Act was passed in 1992, and that all the records were supposed to be released in October of 2017. But between 1998, when the ARRB wrapped up its work, and between that date and 2017, there was supposed to be what was called periodic review of the records, so that the records were downgraded and declassified and released. But no one really knows whether that happened or why there were still tens of thousands of assassination records still stuck in the archives that hadn't been released. Next slide. And that's the really big problem is, there are 30,000, as I found, legally binding and enforceable legal orders that were created by the Assassination Records Review Board, that virtually no one has had access to the full collection of these legal documents. They're essentially a court order that was issued, a written court order. I'm calling it a court order, but it's like a court order, a written legal order on a style, like a form by the ARRB that essentially dispose of either the release or review of every single redaction in every single record. And it's kind of surprising. A lot of the deep file researchers have seen few of these records, but not the collection of them. And there should be a collection of them available. And the Archivist of the United States was legally responsible for implementing the orders that the ARRB imposed back in between 1994 and 1998. And the fact is, these final determinations really should have been made public, and they should have been front and center over the last 30 years. And by 2017, there should really have only been a handful of records that still remained withheld from public disclosure. Next slide. I'll just go back 1 second very quickly. The ARRB was created as a result of the JFK Records Act. This is one of the final screen credits from Oliver Stone's JFK. And this really, I think this was like a last minute addition to the film. And it says that the files of the House Select Committee on Assassinations will be locked away until the year 2029. And that really offended the American people. And people across the United States and from around the world wrote congressional representatives and senators. They wrote the president, said something had to be done about all these millions of pages of records that were being kept from the American people about the assassination. Next slide. So in 1992, Congress unanimously passed the JFK Records Act, which created the Assassination Records Review Board. And I bolded and underlined, the ARRB was an independent federal agency. And that agency had the power and authority to obtain records that would have otherwise remained classified and to review those records. And then most importantly, they had the authority and the power to either release those records to the public or require the records to be reviewed in a specified way under the standards of the Act on a specified future date. In the end, all of the records, except with very, very few exceptions, were supposed to be released on October 26, 2017, was 25th anniversary of the passage of the Act. And as we know, President Trump, with the urging of the then director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, decided he was just going to en masse postpone the release. First, it was for a few months, then it was up until 2021. And both President Trump and President Biden sadly kicked the can down the road. Now, there's no provision in the Act that really says that a president could just en masse with no written reasons for each record without applying the standards, Section 6 of the Act, kick it down the road like that. But that's what happened. Both President Trump and Biden really did have poor legal advice from the Office of Legal Counsel, and particularly an attorney at the Office of Legal Counsel named Curtis Gannon, who issued a memo in 2017 that basically told the president he could do whatever he wants with the records, and that the standards of Section 6 don't apply, and he didn't need to issue written reasons for each record. Next slide. Initially, this goes back to the problems that I addressed a few slides ago. This is Section 2A3 of the Act. I'm going to try to not get too in the weeds with the law, because everyone will go to sleep, not just Barb and rocking chair.
That's why we put them on before that chat.
Section 2A3, it's really the main purpose of the JFK Records Act. It was to create legislation in order to create an enforceable, independent, and accountable process for the public disclosure of assassination records. And the really key part there is the enforceable and accountable parts of that provision. Because up until this point in time, there's really been no accountability from any agency with regard to the records. And you'll see as we go on, the final determinations are really the pointy end of the legal sphere that the JFK Records Act created. They're the enforceable part. It's like, again, you enforce court orders, and these final determinations that are issued by an independent federal agency with the power and authority to create these enforceable orders. That section is really key. Next slide. There are just a few sections of the law here. Section 9C3B of the JFK Records Act is the provision of the act that actually dictates that the ARRB has to create individual final determination or legal order for each record, and each redaction inside each record has to be contained in that legal order. So the key parts of that are under subsection 3. It basically said that with respect to each assassination record or particular information in an assassination record, which would be postponed from public disclosure, and again pursuant to section 6, which is the criteria for postponement, the review board shall, so that's a mandatory word in the legislation, shall create and transmit to the archivist a report. So the report is the ARRB final determination notification. And inside that report, subsection B gives the details of what has to be included. And that is a review of the proceedings taken by the ARRB with the decisions in regard to the proceedings, and all of this again has to be in writing, and a recommended specified time at which a specified occurrence following which the material may be appropriately disclosed to the public under the Act. Again, I've touched on this, so I'll just breeze through this part. Agency final orders are an important concept at law. They're the final binding, legally enforceable decisions made by an independent agency or another agency of the government, and they mark the end of a process. So there has to be some finality with regard to each of these records, and the ARRB final determinations mark the end of the ARRB's review process. Only final orders can be appealed to the courts for judicial review. And so again, these final determinations kind of hit all the marks of an agency final order. And there were appeal provisions under section 91 of the JFK Records Act that allowed agencies, if they disagreed with an ARRB decision, they could kind of appeal the decision or dispute it to the president. And as you'll see in a little bit, the president only had a very short window of 30 days to either certify the ARRB's decision and back it up, or the president had to issue a written certification overriding the ARRB's orders.
Andrew,
Yes.
just quick, how much time did the intelligence agencies have to decide to review?
Yeah, they only had 14 days after the ARRB issued their decision. So the ARRB would issue their decision, and I'm going to go through like notice, because when you issue a final legal order, you have to give notice to the affected parties. But there were various ways that they had to give public notice and notice to the affected parties that they had issued a decision. So the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, they only had 14 days. It was very short because the ARRB's term of operations was only between 1994 and 1998, and they had millions of pages of records to review. So they didn't want the slow rolling that eventually did happen. All right, next slide. So one more. So this is actually a copy of an ARRB final determination notification. And if I could, the red markings are mine, but you can see it shows the originating agency. This is the CIA up here. The next line down is what's generally known as the RIF number. And then it shows what series it is. And then each agency had their own file number system. And so that's the header of the final determination notification. Going down, you can see this particular one was issued on March 26, 1996. That's the date that it was issued. And then as you go down, it will usually show the number of postponements. Sorry, that's it shows 7 a little bit further down. And then below the number of postponements, it'll start postponement number 1. It's on page 1. And they do this in detail. This is for each redaction within a record. This is detailed stuff. So in this particular case, there was a redaction on page 1. We'll see later on when I show you a couple of other really key final determinations, how it actually operated. So each postponement had to have a legal justification under Section 6. This particular one was Section 6(1)(a) of the JFK Records Act. That's the identity of a CIA asset or an agent that they didn't want to disclose. Now, this is the most pertinent part. Down here, it has, on this one, postponement number 1, it gives a review date. That's a specific date on which the ARRB is ordering this particular record, RIC number 104, 115, 103, 85. On March 1996, the ARRB is ordering the archivist of the United States, specifically ordering the archivist to review this redaction on March 1996. Pay attention, because on postponement number 2, the ARRB is ordering something different. They're ordering that this second redaction be released in January of 2006. Okay, so you have review orders and you have release orders for each different redaction within a record. Okay, we'll come back to that because it becomes quite important with what we found at the National Archives. Next slide. So I've already gone through this. Those are the key parts of the final determination notification. Next slide. A lot of information on this one. The ARRB had a mammoth job because of the fact that there were so many pages of records. They had to really review, I think it was up to 6 million, 5 or 6 million pages of records. There were probably about 70,000 individual records that they ended up reviewing, but some of them were consent releases by the agencies. In the end, the ARRB ended up reviewing more than 27,000 individual records in which they actually made either postponement decisions or decisions to release. So there were disputes or postponements on over 27,000 records, and each of those 27,000 records generated a final determination notification. The job was so huge that the ARRB employed a couple of computer specialists to develop. Back then they used Lotus Notes. I'm not really familiar with Lotus Notes, but I understand it's kind of an email software that can track the flow of work. And I spoke actually to the computer specialist at the ARRB. His name is Chet Rhodes. He was pretty generous with the information that he provided, but we'll be discussing that in a little bit. This system allowed the ARRB to create automated reports, a number of different reports depending on the data that they plugged into it. So this system would spit out an ARRB final determination once all the data was entered for a record. And in terms of how they handled it, they were required, the ARRB, to actually print out a copy of each final determination and physically attach it to each assassination record, and then physically deliver assassination records with the final determinations to the National Archivist at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. So there was a real process to all of this. They had to make decisions, they had to track the decisions, they had to track individual redactions. And for example, the Lopez report, I believe that had over 300 redactions, individual postponements within that one single report. So the final determination notification for the Lopez report contains a massive number of legal orders. Next slide. I've talked about the appeal process. When you think about the massive scale of the ARRB's work and the fact that the agencies were pretty opposed to the whole concept of releasing their secret records. When you think about the president is solely responsible for like making the ultimate decision whether a record's going to be postponed or released. The ARRB General Counsel, Jeremy Gunn, is like, we can't possibly expect President Clinton to be reviewing thousands and thousands of individual appeals, because each appeal was treated like a mini motion or a court case. And so they filed dozens of pages of briefs with regard to each redaction. And President Clinton's White House office essentially told the agencies and the ARRB, get out of here. I'm not dealing with this. You guys figure this out. I'm not going to issue certifications on this unless you guys really raise something extremely serious. It goes through my staff. My staff say this is serious enough that we're going to deal with this. And in fact, the White House and the Assassination Records Review Board, the review board drafted a memorandum of understanding in 1995 and sent it to the White House. And the memorandum of understanding laid out that we recognize the president's a busy guy and that he's not going to want to go through thousands of different appeals. And so if the president was going to override an ARRB decision, that's the only time that the president would issue a written certification overriding it pursuant to the act. If the president gets notice of an appeal, they have to give the president a whole list of decisions, and those are a completely different form than the final determination. Confusingly, they named the big list of decisions formal determinations. So you've got to figure out what's a final determination, what's a formal determination. The formal determinations are just long lists of RIF numbers, and then it shows the number of postponements, and then it just gives a random date. You don't know whether that's a release date or a review date. They would send that to the president. They would release those to the public. And then if there were any disputes, the agencies would have to notify the president within 14 days. Here's the critical part. Unless the president was going to issue a written certification overriding the ARRB's decision, he wouldn't provide a written certification. The president, in the memorandum of understanding, agreed that if no written override was provided by the White House or the president, then the ARRB's decision became final, binding, enforceable legal orders that were to dispose of each assassination record. That's a big deal. And the interesting thing is, I looked for a signed copy of the memorandum of understanding, couldn't find one anywhere, couldn't find one at the archives. I contacted Judge Tungheim. He goes, oh, I'm pretty sure they signed something, but I don't remember for sure. And Jeremy Gunn, who I also communicated with, didn't recall whether they returned the memorandum of understanding. So I contacted the Clinton Presidential Library, and they sent me back a full copy of their entire record of discussions with the NSC, going over the memorandum of understanding, and I got the approval. So President Clinton did in fact approve the memorandum of understanding. And I've got a copy of that memorandum in the first article that I wrote for Kennedy's and King on this. Next slide. We talked about that. Next slide. So in the 4 years that the ARRB existed, President Clinton did not override one single ARRB final determination on any of the records that the ARRB issued the determinations on. So what that means is that each of the 27,000 plus ARRB final determinations are now binding and enforceable legal orders. And any chance that the agencies had to appeal those orders expired 30 days after the ARRB issued the order. Well, those are binding final legal orders. Next slide. I can kind of breeze over this. There were a lot of delays setting up the ARRB. It took 2 years to appoint members. They didn't get their appropriations, so they couldn't get an office right away. They didn't know what an assassination record was, so they had to go through deliberations and hear public comment and then vote on what an actual assassination was under the Act. So they did not issue any final determinations until June 20, 1995. And they were well into their term. And I think initially their full term, they were supposed to be done everything by October of 1996. So they were under the gun from day one. They ended up getting a couple of extensions, which extended their life to September of 1998. So by the start of 1996, they were getting very nervous about being able to complete the job. They knew they had millions of records to review. Next slide. So they were so nervous that the executive director, David Marwell, issued an internal memo to the staff and to the 5 board members. And he said at that point, we're going to have to review on average 1,100 records for each of the next 8 months in order to stay on track. And as bad as those numbers are, they pale in comparison to the review rate that will need to be reached in the board's last year if we're going to succeed in reviewing the remaining estimated 66,000 records from the CIA's sequester collection and the FBI's HSCA collection. One thing that's absolutely certain is that we can't achieve these review rates and complete our mandate unless we make changes in the way we conduct our business. They were terrified that they weren't going to be able to finish their job. Next slide. This was an internal memo, June 16 to 18, 1997. And this initially triggered my understanding of how important the final determination forms were. By June of 1997, they had a massive pile of physical printed copies of the final determinations. And they needed to be physically attached to the assassination records before they got delivered over to the archives. And this memo basically is a project for their junior ARRB staff. They were looking for volunteers for people to physically attach these records to the assassination records. Next slide. I've got to say that the fact that these records were so were so hidden at the National Archives, and only a few had trickled out publicly over the last 30 years. A lot of people were denying the fact that there were final determinations for all the assassination records. And as part of my research for an article that just got released yesterday, I scraped hundreds of thousands of internal ARRB email messages. I came across this one. Peter Voth was a senior employee at the ARRB, and the date's kind of important. November 22nd, 1998. That's 8 days before the ARRB's mandate ended on September 30th, 1998. And Peter Voth writes, hey, I need to basically commandeer the back printer at the ARRB, so please don't print anything on that printer. We need it to print 14,000 final determination forms. No joke. If I was just pulling a number out of a hat, I don't think I'd pick 14,000, right? And the fact is, I've been looking for even like a couple of dozen of these final determinations from 97 and 98. And here this guy is basically acknowledging there's, again, a monumental task of printing out all these forms. Next slide. I touched on this a little bit earlier. The whole legal concept of ministerial duties. I think here in the UK, like in Canada, you have ministers that manage different government portfolios. In the US, they don't call their secretaries of state a minister, but they still have ministerial duties. And ministerial duties are like legal mandated responsibilities, tasks, requirements that are placed on specific officials of the government or specific agencies. And they're described as mandatory, precise, non-discretionary, discrete duties that leave the official or the agency with no discretion and no wiggle room. So the law is very, very specific on how the official is to undertake that duty. And usually you can see we pointed out in section 9C3B, the word shall is an indication that something is going to be impose a ministerial duty. Ministerial duties are a really essential element to ensure that the rule of law is followed, and that officials don't step outside the law with really important tasks and duties, and that they don't behave arbitrarily or capriciously, which is a language under the Administrative Procedures Act in the US. Next slide. So the fact that there are so many ministerial duties in the JFK Records Act really shows that Congress wanted things to be done a very specific way. And they didn't want to give agencies like the CIA or the FBI or the Secret Service any discretion to mess around with the job at hand, which was to release all of the JFK assassination records in a timely way and in a transparent way. So they were very, very particular about the way they imposed the ministerial duties. Next slide. I've talked about notice. There were 4 ways that Congress required the ARRB to report these final determinations or their decisions. The first was publishing them in the Federal Register. And the Federal Register, I think here it's like Hansard. Hansard is yeah. So any official action has to be reported and answered in the United States. It's a Federal Register. So you'll see every month that the ARRB met, within 7 days after the meeting, they had to publish all of the decisions of the ARRB in the Federal Register, which is open to the public. They also had to issue notices of the formal determinations, not final, the formal determinations to the originating agencies and the other officials. And then they also had to issue full detailed final determinations directly to the Archivist of the United States, because the Archivist had particular ministerial duties to catalog and index all of the records. Finally, the ARRB had to issue an annual report for each year that it operated. So there should have been a report for 1994, 95, 96, 97, and 98. That's 5. Next slide. This is yeah, you know what? I'm sorry if it's too much detail about what the law imposed, but it's kind of important to know, because guess what? After the ARRB went out of business, almost none of it happens, right? So this is from the legal analysis that Jeremy Gunn, who's the chief legal counsel of the ARRB, he basically outlines that what's required under Section 9C3B, and that's a report that has to be sent to the archivist containing a description of the actions, a specified time or occurrence for the records to be opened. And then it also basically says that information is also required for some of the other reports, but they'll make one report, the final determination notification, to ensure that all this happened. Next slide. I won't go into detail on this. There's a lot of words. This is the section 9F 3G of the JFK Records Act that required the annual reports. And the last section, G, required that the ARRB include in each annual report a full appendix that included full copies of all final determinations. So again, these should all be publicly available each year that the ARRB existed. Next slide. So Eileen Sullivan was the press officer for the ARRB for most of the time. And this shows that the National Archives wasn't just really passively taking in records from the ARRB. They weren't just, you know, taking piles of paper and shoving them on a shelf somewhere. They were really monitoring what was going on, because in this, I don't know what the date is, but in this memo, it shows that Eileen Sullivan was contacted by Martha Murphy of the National Archives. She's a pretty well-known name at the archive. She was one of the senior archivists responsible for the JFK records. And Martha Murphy identified 2 assassination records out of probably thousands that she received, and said, hey, we didn't get final determination forms for these 2 particular records. So back then, senior archivists were going, these final determinations are important documents, and you forgot 2 of them, please send them. And there were follow-up emails to rectify that situation. So the ARRB took it pretty seriously too. Next slide. This is another legal part of it, but Section 5G1 of the JFK Records Act imposes on the Archivist of the United States specifically, again, it's a discrete, mandatory, non-discretionary, specific legal duty that's placed on the Archivist of the United States specifically, that the Archivist was responsible for the periodic review of postponed records consistent with the ARRB's final determinations under Section 9C3B. And under Section 5G2, the archivist specifically also had a further ministerial duty to publicly disclose such records that were ordered released by the ARRB. So really, not only did the National Archivists and the National Archives not, like they apparently didn't conduct a periodic review consistent with the ARRB records. They essentially buried these final determinations so the public can't see them, the public can't enforce them, and no one really knows what's happened. This is what happened to the periodic review process that was mandated by the law. It got buried, and no one really has seen the whole collection of these records for almost 30,000 final determinations of the ARRB. Next slide. So because I couldn't find a collection online, I organized with my co-author back there, Paul Blow, and Jeff Crudell, who's a podcaster. He does JFK, The Enduring Secret, great podcast. We decided to go to National Archives. I set up a visit, like I think 6 weeks ahead of my trip. We ended up going right before the conferences in Dallas. I think we were there like the 3rd week of November for about 3 or 4 days. And so part of the setup was you make advanced pull requests for specific documents, very specific. I asked the National Archives to provide access to all 27,000 ARRB final determinations. Pretty clear, right?
Why you took 2 mates along, is it?
Yeah, you know what? I did actually want witnesses, and it was good. I mean, if Paul wants to come up, he was an eyewitness there for some of the occurrences that happened at the National Archives. We did everything by the book. We had to get certified. We got a little piece of paper, like a certificate, that we're qualified to look at papers and touch papers. It took quite a bit of finagling to get through that process, but you know what, I respect their process, because it's not just the JFK records. They have like ancient papers in there that they want to protect, so they want to be able to track who's handling the documents. Next slide. So this box is one of the boxes. We walked in, and they wheeled out a fairly large and heavy cart. It had about 16 boxes, these gray boxes on it. There were about 6 per level. There were 3 levels, and this was one of the first boxes that I opened up. You can't really probably read the writing on the tabs, but all of them have dates on them, and they have the words formal determinations and final determinations. And they were essentially, they gave me 10 boxes of formal determination forms. That's not what I asked for. It's not what I was looking for. What those are just the lists of RIF numbers and a couple of other columns of numbers. They don't provide any of the written details. They are definitely not final determination forms. And as I went from box to box, they all essentially look like that, and they contained information that was virtually useless for my research. It was useless to try to enforce any of those, because they really don't give you enough information to do anything with. So there were like 12 or 13 boxes of those.
What was their explanation, Andrew, for not giving you final determinations? Was that like a clerical oversight? Or...
Yeah, you know,
they not understand English.
oversight. So I'll get to that.
Next year.
The next slide, though, is pretty fascinating, because guess what? On the 13th box, like the 3rd last box, you can see that that's a small stack of final determinations. I remember turning to Paul and Jeff, who were not allowed to stand behind my desk. You know, I said jackpot to these guys, because I found some final determinations. And if you could see the writing on the accordion file, they're from, I think, October 1996. I can't see even on mine. So they were from 1996, and there were about 450 individual paper copies of final determinations. And I was like, very, very happy. I thought, okay, this is the start of something, but I only had 2 more boxes on that card. So there's a big red arrow, and this is kind of an important part of the story. If you go to the next slide, this is the box that it came in. And I don't know whether at the back you can see that box is labeled press and public contacts. And press and public contacts really have nothing to do with the fact that that box contains like the most important legal documents created by the ARRB. And when you go to search that particular box, it says press and public contacts. So there's no way on the ARRB system that you can find final determinations in that particular box. So I kind of, is it mislabeled? Is it like is it a term of art for people who know better than me? I have no idea why it was labeled press and public contacts. I do understand that Eileen Sullivan, who is press officer for the ARRB, she handled a lot of the final determinations because she was in charge of distributing them to the agencies and to the Federal Register. But this made it virtually impossible. And to answer your question, Paul and I called one of the senior JFK archivists down, and I presented him with my lovely cart with 16 boxes. And I said, let's take a look at some of those top boxes. And I said, I came and I specifically requested final determinations. And he goes, yeah. And I go, well, let's open this box. And he opens it, and it was formal determinations. Same. We went down the row, all formal determinations. Then I pointed to that 13th box on the bottom row. I said, let's look at that one, right? And he opened it up, and he pulled out the stack of final determinations, and he took a couple of steps back, and he was like, and I'm like, those are the ones that I want. And I go, where are the other 30,000 of those ones? Right? And like, oh, like there was no word of a lie. It was like that. And he's like, I don't know. I don't know what, like, I don't know what. I go, where do we find, where are they in the catalog? Where are they indexed? Like, there are 30,000 of these. I want those. We're here for another 2 or 3 days. Let's have them. And then we went on Paul's computer, and we pulled up the catalog, and we asked them to show us.
Yeah.
Where are they in the catalog? And he had no answer. And
how senior was this guy?
I think he was senior JFK archivist. I don't want, we're being recorded. I don't want to, they were all professional at the archives. They were kind of, I won't call them friendly, but they were professional. Yeah, he was a senior archivist responsible for the JFK records.
Did you get a name?
Yeah, I know who he is. Yeah.
I'm just going to pause the recording. Okay, go ahead.
So the next question I had was, well, why the hell are they in a box labeled press and public contacts? Right? And again, he had no explanation. And then he quickly left. and that was it. And I put in multiple requests for other series of boxes while we were there. All I got was 450 of the 27,000 supposed final determination forms. So next slide. Yeah, so the grand sum of the 3 days we spent at National Archives was 450 ARRB final determinations. That amounts to 1.667 of the total estimated number of final determinations known to be issued by the ARRB as required by the Act. Now, I don't know whether you can play the video quickly with Judge Tunheim. Now, this is from Judge Tunheim's, before you unpause it. This is from Judge Tunheim's testimony on May 20th. I'm just going to do 2 minutes of it. But he acknowledges, yeah, we made 27,000 decisions, but more importantly, a little bit later on, I didn't like his testimony when I first listened to it, but I've listened to it a few times subsequently. He's very, very critical of the archives publicly in front of Congress. So let's play it and listen.
In all, the board issued over 27,000 individual rulings. These were decisions on requests by agencies to protect information. Most redacted information had release dates attached to them. We made it easy for the researchers to determine whether a redacted name appeared in different locations so that they would know it was the same person. There were a further 33,000 consent releases, which essentially means that the agency saw the handwriting on the wall and released the documents directly since we were likely to order release. When we finished, there were nearly 5 million pages at the National Archives. We made the decision early that we would not protect any information directly related to the assassination because of the high level of public interest. By 2017, when the last records were to be released under the Act, there were probably not more than 1,500 review board redactions that were remaining. The Act was clear in stating that despite the review board wrapping up its work in 1998, the Act was to continue in effect, which meant that agencies had the obligation to continue to present information. Most of the redactions now in the documents are within documents never shown to the review board, but were transferred to NARA at a later time.
Now that I use
Oh,
Monday,
no.
Hey, free advertising.
Monday, sir.
Agencies largely complied with the mandate to present records to the review board. However, there are many delays and denials with records that we specifically requested, and there were many skirmishes along the way. It does not take a rocket scientist to realize that agencies were awaiting the end of our 3-year mandate. The first 500 or so adverse disclosure decisions we made in FBI records were appealed to the president, and the appeals were dropped when White House counsel, former judge, and Representative Abner Mikva told the FBI to drop the appeals because President Clinton would deny all of them. FBI staff was helpful to us, but I'm now seeing records in the new releases that were not disclosed to the review board. The CIA was cooperative and processed many documents with us, but we never received much of what we specifically asked for. When asked, for example, for documents involving James Angleton that we had not seen, I was told the documents were no longer maintained as a collection. We received only 3 memoranda that incorporated the agency's review of Angleton's counterintelligence files, not the files themselves, just a review by someone else of the files. We were told that all the other documents had been destroyed. I'm now seeing a flood of documents that clearly meet the definition of assassination records involving Angleton and others that were not submitted to us for review. When CIA analysts would not tell us the details of their secret operations, our response was, okay, we'll release the record in 10 days. We then heard the details and could make a reasonable decision. We had in our hands a small file on George Joannides that was disclosed. It disclosed nothing really, so it was returned. We didn't know the details of his work at the time. We now know much more about Joannides, and his file should be immediately disclosed. There's no reason anymore for protecting those files. Clearly, we were misled. I actually wrote to President Biden asking that he order the CIA to release the Joannides file, and I never received a response. The Secret Service was very difficult. They were the only agency that we were aware of that tried to reclassify assassination records after we were in office. They attempted to classify documents that had already been released publicly and fought us over 1963 threat sheets that was still in process when we left office. The Department of State was less than helpful, although they released records in their possession. When we negotiated with Russian officials over the Oswald files in Moscow, they did not lift a finger to help us, not even allowing us access to the United States Embassy. When we tried to get access to Belarusian records on Oswald, they did not help. When we planned meetings with Mexican and Cuban officials, they stopped us from direct contacts. The act specifically required the Department of State to help us find foreign records. The National Archives was very helpful to us when we did our work.
This is an
Very
important
dedicated
part.
staff member, Stephen Tilley, was instrumental in getting our work done. But since we left office, I've been disappointed the archives has not devoted more personnel to the records. We had planned that the archives would continue our work to the extent possible. For the most part, that has not happened, and the agency has never been in contact with me. So there are other files that should be real.
So you can tell he's actually unhappy. You know, Judge Tunheim, you know, he's a dispassionate man. He had a huge job. He was an excellent chair of the ARRB. I think the ARRB did a ton of work in a very short period of time. But his dispassion really there's just seemed to be a lack of curiosity from Judge Tunheim and other senior members of the ARRB with what happened to the ultimate culmination of their work, these legal orders. They knew that they issued them. And you would think that they would want to know whether the archivist followed up with the orders that they were mandated by law to implement. If we could go back to the so couldn't find them at the National Archives, couldn't find them online with Mary Farrell, maybe by chance an odd dozen or so, and all from 1995, 1996. Until last night when researcher Joe Bax, I think Joe might be online.
He is, yeah.
You know, Joe Bax sent me the first ARRB final determination that I've ever seen from 1997 or 1998 last night. They really are not available. Next slide. So this left me with, okay, I can at least get all the copies in the annual reports, right? They had to issue 5 annual reports. Each report had to have an appendix that contained all of the final determinations issued for each year. Well, good luck finding annual reports. You know, they're not readily available. I could find draft copies, but the drafts never contained any of the appendices. What I learned later is that the ARRB never issued annual reports for 1997 or 1998. I ended up tracking down copies of the annual reports at Quinnipiac Law Library in New Haven, Connecticut. And with the help of a very friendly librarian there, she sent me copies of both the 95 and 96 reports. But only the 1995 report had an appendix that contained the final determination forms. 96, no final determination form appendix in 1996. Next slide. So as you can see, this is the index for the appendices from the 1996. This is the draft. Okay. So again, 95 had a very similar index to the appendices. You can see the second appendix, final determination forms. The third appendix is formal determination forms. All right, next slide. This is the actual final index for the appendices. And they just, again, this is 96. They just took out the appendix. So the draft of 96 report had all the final determinations, but when they actually issued it, they just removed that appendices entirely. Next slide. So I asked the archivist again, I asked them again for copies of all of the final determinations. I also asked them for copies of all the annual reports. And this is part of an email that I received, I think it was in June, it was this month, I just received this. And the archivist said I couldn't locate what looked like a complete set of annual reports of my searches. Unfortunately, the agency, the ARRB, did not provide a central index for these electronic records. The files are arranged in folders as created by the agency, and the name of the folders files can sometimes be helpful for determining the contents of the files. You will likely need to download the files and unzip them to search them for records of interest, but none of those folders contain appendices. Also in this message, she advised that they don't have any collection digital of final determinations, which I found really interesting. I know my time is running out. So next slide. I'm gonna try to bring this back out to a wider perspective. When the Congress enacted the JFK Records Act, it simply didn't leave the whole concept of periodic review and the release of records to chance. They very clearly mandated that the ARRB would have the legal authority to issue binding and enforceable agency final orders. They also imposed a mandatory, non-discretionary ministerial duty on the archivist of the United States to strictly comply with the ARRB's agency final orders and to strictly implement the ordered specific periodic review and release of the assassination records that was consistent with the ARRB final determinations. Next slide. As of today's date, and a lot of time and energy spent trying to hunt these down, I've only been able to obtain actually a total of 751 final determinations. There were 301 final determinations in that 1995 annual report appendix, but most of those final determinations dealt with HSCA staff, IRS, like social security numbers. So they were all redacted and they're just social security numbers for HSCA staff, really not relevant information with regard to the assassination. The only box that the final determinations were found in was labeled press and public contacts, which rendered the contents virtually unsearchable in the archives catalog. The archives have failed to respond to a legally served FOIA request for all of the final determinations. We're considering following up that request with a lawsuit against the National Archivist for the production of these records. And again, the National Archives have claimed to be unable to locate any set of our final determinations. Really, only the archivist under oath in front of Congress can answer all of these questions. What the hell has happened? Now, I'm really going to wind up quickly here. Next slide. What we did find in that 450 sample of final determinations, but the ARRB did issue these final orders. They required hundreds of the 450 records to be released in January 2006. And we created a database and we matched Paul did a ton of work on this database. It's an interactive database. You can pull up both a copy of the final determination and a full copy of the latest version of the actual assassination record. And what we found is for hundreds of these records that the ARRB ordered released in January 2006, these records were not released until 2018, 2021, 2023, 2025. And when we created the database, there were some records that even continued to be withheld, even though the ARRB ordered them released in 2006. And you can literally see on the next page, you can see that for this particular record, again, it's a CIA record. The final determination was issued April 18, 1996. There were 5 postponements. And for each of the postponements, you can see release date, January 2006, postponement number 2, January 2006, postponement number 3. There you can go to the next page. All of them all have release dates, not review dates. They have release dates requiring that these redactions be lifted and the entire document publicly released in January 2006. Next page. This is the associated assassination record. You can see the same RIF number at the top. This was from 2022, okay? And you can see this is from Melbourne CIA station. It's directed to the Director of Central Intelligence. The content of this record isn't terribly important, if you ask me.
Is that the chauffeur, the Polish chauffeur?
Yeah, it's one of,
It's important.
okay, Paul says it's important. So
It is.
I'm not a records content guy, I'm the legal guy. I just show how they've broken the law. Next page. So you can see up here, these are 2 redactions, okay? So if you can go back 2 pages. Those 2 redactions are postponement number 4 and number 5 on page 2. They're 6.1b redactions, which are sources and methods. So the CIA has claimed postponements on these. The ARRB agreed that they should be postponed, but released January 2006. Again, go forward 2. Yeah, so that's postponement 4, postponement 5, and go back 1 page. So you can see as of 2022, those redactions were still in place. When we looked in the March, because we created the database in I think November, December, we were working on the database. We didn't have the March 2025 releases. So that 2022 release was the last version of this particular assassination record. When the March release came out, they had finally, the March 2025 release came out, they'd finally released those 2 redactions, even though they were ordered release, again, January 2026. I think these are my last slides. If you can go next one. Yeah. So, you know, a lot of the assassination story revolves around really inexplicable and unconvincing the series of errors, of omissions, mistakes, oversight. And, you know, in the last chapter of Chokeholds, we really do, and it's the largest chapter in the book. I don't know how many pages is it. It's like over 100 pages deal with obstruction of justice in the assassination case. And this, I've raised with the House Oversight Committee, the legal counsel for the House Oversight Committee. I attended the April 1st hearing at their request. And I was directly told that this is probably the clearest evidence that they've seen of unlawful behavior, because the law is pretty clear. The legal orders you've now seen, final determinations that order these records released, they were not released. And there's 0 explanation that we can see. And there were hundreds of records out of that very small 1.667%. There were hundreds of examples how the ARRB's final orders were not complied with.
Have you asked Luna or the committee to get the archivists?
Yes.
Sort of here?
Yes.
There must be a series of archivists
Yes.
over the decades.
Yes.
So
I think there's been about 5 or 6.
See, surely they must be
1990s.
brought
Yeah.
to task here and appear here before the committee.
There needs to be some explanation why these orders have been deep six.
Yeah.
I mean,
Because they can get away with it. It's no different than the Secret Service 30 years ago when they got rid of the files. There's no punishment. There's no like, hey, you're wrong. If you do that, you're going to prison. Where's the problem for these people that do all this when there's no, we could say backlash or anything else or pushback of some sort saying, what you're doing is illegal.
Well,
It's a felony.
They've broken the law.
Neil, I was going to ask that question as well, and I think if the task force, I don't have much faith in the task force, but I think if they don't get the archivists or archivists in front of them, then they're not really serious about getting to the bottom of it all. It's just, it's just a show.
Yeah.
They must bring
So
the
if I can
archivists.
just go back for a second, at the beginning, this is why I had to lay out the law, and I know it's not the most exciting stuff for most people, it's not about, you know, headshots and but when you think about it, I said at the very beginning, this is the sharp end of the spear for the law. Without these final legal orders and the public having access to these final orders, without Congress doing any meaningful oversight or any oversight at all, since the ARRB wound up its operations, we could have taken these decisions to court. We could have enforced them through judicial
Well, it
review.
is being taken off, Phil, isn't it? The Mary, I know you don't want to get into the case, but
Oh, no, we do.
you do want it, okay.
Yeah, you know, I mean, this should have been a very important part of the legal case that was brought against the president. And should have been brought against the archivist of the United States. Unfortunately, it wasn't. I won't get into details about that.
But it is still ongoing though, isn't it?
But very small.
Or has
parts
it
of
been, you know,
It's
subsumed by this?
It's been mostly dismissed. There's a few very small parts of the lawsuit that have survived motions to dismiss. But again, if we had these final, if we had these final, oh, was that Joe Bax?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe. If we had these legal orders, each one of them could have been taken to court. And it would have been a very, very straightforward, you're distracted.
Larry snafu, we said it now.
Yeah, it would have made a big difference to the research community, and that could have started as soon as the orders were requiring that the records be released and the archivists didn't act on it.
But the task force has not been tasked with running another investigation into the assassinations. The objective is to look at the whole records release, review, protocol, whether it upheld the law. So if that's the objective, surely these archivists have got to be brought forward.
I would be surprised if it did not happen. Okay, I haven't received any recent information whether they're going to call the archivist, but I personally think with this information, it's laid right out for them, and they can certainly take a good look at it and call the archivist in, the current one and past archivists. Yes, and if you can just one more, I know we're right on the time.
That's okay, but also I know Joseph Bax does want to come in as well. But do you want to go first, and I'll bring you in second.
Yes.
I guess mine's a pretty big complex question, that it comes down to who's we. In other words, this is all very interesting, we sort of alluded to, we should have done this 10 years ago, who's we?
Which part do you mean, who's we?
Well, who should have done it 10 years ago?
NARA.
Well, NARA is one, but I think any citizen, there are a lot of lawyers in the research community. And had this been kind of the center of the focus, you know, even 5 years ago, leading up to 2017, but I have to be honest, no one really knew the extent of these final determination notifications until, like, I don't want to take, people knew that they existed in small numbers, but in terms of one per record, and that's why there seems to be a bit of a lack of curiosity on the part of the senior members of the ARRB. They didn't have a legal duty to go and try to enforce their orders. They had no duty once their operations wound up. No. But they had to have known that they issued 27,000 orders requiring the release of the records. Why didn't they speak out at some point between 1998 and 2017? Say, hey, what happened to all of these orders? There just seems to be like an absence of care about these particular orders. And the general research community, they weren't aware of the volume of these orders. So when I say we, obviously the US government was happy that these orders kind of remained buried at the National Archives. And it was kind of fortunate if you're on the side of secrecy and obfuscation and God suppression, you know?
Right.
So we as any American citizen that would have wanted to have brought this kind of action, who was aware of these orders. Let me just go to the last couple.
Can I?
Oh, sorry, mate.
Interject really quickly?
Yeah.
What you're describing is no different than what Malcolm says, like where are the Swiper Hart committee files, where are the files on Vesiana, HCA and other HCA files or church committee files and so forth. It doesn't matter what committee we're talking about or what investigative organization. There's always stuff that we know about that's hidden and isn't been dug out or has been denied. And on top of that, they can say whatever they want to say because no one will go there and go, boy, for some reason. And that brings me back to ARRB and Secret Service files. They completely just disowned, even though they were ordered to, and just did their own thing. Why? Because the legal department went, forget about it. You can do this. They can't touch you. Blah blah blah.
What are you going to do about it?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, I have to say this wasn't easy work figuring this out. Because I stumbled across a few things, but like my understanding of general administrative law principles, again, I'm not a US attorney, I'm just a small-time Canadian in-house counsel, as some people like to refer to me. I had to deduce a lot of this, and because of my understanding of administrative law, it was pretty clear how ministerial duties work for me. I knew how agency final orders had to function. I knew there had to be notice. So when I was reviewing the act, it was like putting pieces together and go, there has to be some legal orders sitting around somewhere. I didn't know at the time the extent of it. So I've written part 2 just came out yesterday, like last night it came out. These are lengthy, sometimes painful articles to read. Okay, one I think is 18 pages. And they have pictures though.
We should be able to understand it.
Well, I enjoy like an odd breakup of like this law. But part 1 lays out the whole concept of the final determinations. That lays out a lot of the law. Part 2 talks about ministerial duties and how the archivists of the United States really failed to implement these final determination notifications. And so they're both on Kennedy's and King. I wrote them, so I would say they're worth reading. But I encourage you to take a look. I guarantee they're probably going to get some attention from various quarters, hopefully from Congress. And I'll just do the last slide if we could. We have a website for chokeholds. It's at jfkchokeholds.com. A lot of the documents that you've seen from this are posted on JFK Chokeholds. They're on a section called Documents. And so you can look at them in detail. If you want to see the final determinations, that CIA record that was ordered released, you can see both the final determination and that order. The memorandum of understanding that I got from the Clinton Library that even Judge Tunheim hadn't seen. I sent him a copy of that because he was quite sure again that they had signed it back. So that's new information that no one's seen before as far as I'm aware. We also have a very active Twitter or X feed where we update almost daily, regularly news occurrences about all aspects of the book and about the records and other evidence that comes out. We share a lot of other researchers' good work on the Twitter feed. So thank you. And
Yeah, is that okay? Because I know Joe's Joe, you've unmuted. Do you want to go ahead and make any comments?
Well, I've been working on and off with Andrew. We would email each other back and forth on stuff, and it's not true that there's a final determination notice on each and every JFK record. As he says, there's only 27,000, and in total, there's 330,000 plus JFK records in the JFK records collection. So you're dealing with a very small number of forms. They're really attached to each individual document that the final determination is referring to of what's redacted and why they want to postpone it or put in substitute language or whatever the issue was for each record. So you kind of have to go through everything on Mary Farrell Online or with NARA and with 2017 going forward with what they have scanned online. I've got a lot of records when I went to the archives a lot in the 90s, and I have them at home. So I've been just taking off that front sheet, and I've scanned and sent some to Andrew, and he's got them that way. The JFK task force was originally designed to be a 6-month only thing, and Representative Luna's got like 10 other things she also wants to declassify. So I don't know how much time they can really give to us. Larry seems to indicate that they might get renewed or for another 6 months or something. I don't know. And also Trump is like firing people left, right, and center across the board on the whoever's a federal employee who isn't kissing his butt. So there's I don't think there's a vast reserve of employees at NARA currently that have extension that have worked on JFK assassination records going back to the 90s. So institutional memory for a lot of those people isn't there as we would like. I don't think Steve Tilley is still there. I think he might have retired. Some people that Malcolm worked with are no longer there. I don't know if Martha Moyer, I met her once. She was nice. I don't know if she's still there. So you're dealing with folks that don't quite comprehend the issue, I think, with Andrew. I don't think people that Andrew was working with either knew or got the issue Andrew was trying to get across of the difference between final and formal. So, so that was a problem. But I think the 27,000 records he's looking for are there, but they're not in a specific individual folder of just those final determination forms. They're spread out in the whole collection. So just to add my 2 cents. I also found a interesting document last night that Andrew has, and I think has been passed around. and put it on my Substack. It was included in a document, and I don't think anyone was really supposed to see it. It just kind of was shoved in with the rest of the forms on this one RIF number, which was a form the intelligence community used as to why they wanted to declass or why they wanted to withhold something in full or in part. So Andrew could pass that around to you, and it's on my Substack.
I just quickly respond. Yeah, Joe, I really appreciate everything you've done. You know what, you've been a hard taskmaster on being accurate, and I 100% agree with you that the final determinations, they weren't issued on every single record that went through the ARRB, but they were, like you say, required for each record that was postponed from public disclosure. And so you know, there were a lot of records that that just got automatically released, and even some of those got final determination notifications issued right at the beginning when they started. CR really wasn't, they didn't know what their own practices were. But Joe's been great, and I appreciate all of his work, and it's really contributed significantly to what I've done over the last few years. So thank you. I am not.
Would you make your presentation available to us?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. A lot of information to take in there. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed.